My name is Jokum Jensen, and I'm a blacksmith. I'm also an artist, and I'm also now, for the last year, I'm a teacher at this lovely place. So I'm teaching both in the metal art department, and I'm also teaching all the university first-year students in sketching and sketch process, which I'm very happy to do. And for maybe the first time in my life, I've actually made a script that I'm going to try to stick to. So I'll be reading a little bit while we're doing this. Bear with me. It says here that I've also been self-employed for 25 years as a blacksmith. So working a lot, mainly with historical work. So I've been doing a lot of restoration work. I'm from Denmark originally, and I was situated in Denmark and working a lot with historical sites there. So in this talk, I will try to present some of the things that I've found working with historical sites and buildings and with restoration blacksmithing. And I'm hoping to open up for some questions. So I have questions. I don't really have that many answers. I have opinions, but that's not necessarily the right answers. So I'd like for you to take this talk as an opportunity to open up for questions, and we can talk about those questions during this conference. This is what it's all about, to try to establish new links and new ideas and try to find new solutions. So the first thing I would like to do is to try and establish some kind of link between contemporary interpretations of historical blacksmithing, which is what I'm going to be talking about, and the theme of the conference, which is, I guess, to a large extent, death, or at least the traditions around death and the way that we use tradition and ritual to handle strong emotions in our society. And I see, or I think that often when things happen like this, that you have someone in your family or someone that you know that are dying or dies, then you need to have some kind of framework around that. And often we skip as humans back to some kind of tradition, and we establish rituals around that tradition. And for us that are working as blacksmiths, I think it's important that we maybe can link that to our own traditions, so our own cultural traditions and our historical traditions and our aesthetic traditions within our trade. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, how to work with that. So what is tradition? Oh, it changed here, but doesn't change on the screen. Hi, now. Help. No, but it doesn't change that. But no, well, it's a nice picture anyway, isn't it? So we can look at that for the inside. It would have been easier just with a hammer and an anvil, but that's how it goes. Yeah, hey. There you go, new one.
Now you can use the arrows again.
No, that's all right. So what is tradition? How do we work with it? This was just kind of the thoughts that came into my mind when I was thinking about this. I think as blacksmiths, and I have to say that for you to get the full picture, I'm trained in England.
Yay!
Before Dell was so a very long time ago. But I think what that gave me was something that I don't have from Denmark, and we don't really have in the same way in Sweden as well, like a really deep-rooted idea of what tradition is. So I think blacksmithing in England is a very traditional thing. I know that it also is that in France and in certainly in some of the other countries as well. We have a lot of Germans here. You also have a really strong tradition. I'm very honored and happy to be part of that tradition, but I also sometimes think that tradition can be a little bit of a straitjacket, something that holds us in a maybe more conservative place than what we really need to be. So you probably like have these people around you who are striving to uphold a tradition by all means, and they don't really know why, but they need to do that. You also have the people who will honor, but then interpret within some guidelines. And I've been working a lot with that in restoration. So where do you start and where do you stop with restoration something? You can just get inspired. I see a lot of people doing that. So they take a scroll from here and a color from there and whatever. And it's all kind of a mix from all kinds of different time periods and styles, which we'll talk more about that. And then you can try and ignore it and it will go away. Quite a few people are also doing that within our trade. And maybe we need to find ways through this that are actually conscious choices instead of just things that happen. Right, I'm going to try and press this and see. Oh, yes. So what I think is important is that we try to find a meeting of our own artistic intent, a knowledge of the stylistic history of the craft, and then an understanding of the site in which you work. Like obviously the artistic intent, that's you. That's what you want to do. That's what you want to show who you are. And in order to work with that, you need to know that. So you need to work with who you are as an artist. Then having the knowledge of the history of the craft is something that I personally find really important, because that enables you to, like, if you have all this knowledge about your geographical styles or places, or when is this color used in that, in relation to that scroll, and all these kind of things, then you can make choices about either using this, utilizing this, or you can choose to ignore it, but then you ignore it from a place of knowledge instead of a place of ignorance. And I think that is important. And then you have to have an understanding of the site in which you work. I think maybe the graveyard environment is more self-explanatory than a lot of other sites that we end up in. But you still need to kind of have an understanding of what you're doing there, not only in relation to kind of practical things, but also in all the emotional things that happens in all the sites that we're working. So that's kind of the introduction. Then I want to talk to you briefly about my own experience with this. So when I did my MA at this institution, I made this little publication and send it around maybe, with the very easy and short title of Interpreting the Past, Working with Contemporary Interpretations of Scandinavian 17th Century Decorative Metalwork in Relation to Historical Buildings. It kind of just rolls off the tongue really easily. Not pretentious at all. But I really wanted to do this because I had one of the main reasons for me to come here as an older student. So I started in this institution when I had run my own business for maybe 10, 12 years. And I was extremely frustrated, especially with architects, especially with Scandinavian architects, very specifically with Danish architects and the ones working within restoration, because there seemed to be not really a lot of knowledge and not a lot of understanding of what you could actually do in the historical sites. And I often found that these architects, in lack of knowledge, settled for something that had to be neutral. And in their world, neutral was modernism. And if I'm working with a 17th century manor house, I don't think modernism is neutral. I think modernism is an intrusion. But that's a discussion that was really hard to have with someone who had a longer education than me. That's like the main reason to do a BA and an MA here, to have like a piece of paper to say that I have been studying just as long as they had and I actually done something about it. Unfortunately, they don't give a shit, so it didn't really matter much. But I was really happy to work with these things, and I think it's some really important things to work with. So my study was centered around the cathedral in Aarhus, which is the second largest city in Denmark. And in that church, there's 5 gates ascribed to the only Danish blacksmith who has any kind of reputation. He's a working in the 1600, from 1620 roughly to 1650, and he's of course German. We've imported him from Germany to work for the Danish Renaissance King Christian IV. He's called Caspar Finke, and he has made some really, really interesting German Renaissance style work in that cathedral and a few other places. So that was kind of my way in. I wanted to work with that. And I wanted to try and make a fictional project where I would do small grills for this cathedral in a style that could kind of have a reference to the work of Caspar Finke that was already there, but also be clearly contemporary. That was kind of the offset of it. So the first thing I did was that, so here you see one of the grills of Caspar Finke, and he's quite interesting in the way that he never copies a panel, so all his panels are different. This was these are panels that are in the church, and they are actually doing the same thing that I wanted to do. So they're made in the 1930s to cover the radiators from when the church got central heating installed. And I haven't been able to find out who actually made this. So already in the 1930s, it was just a blacksmith, no one really cared. But I think they are interesting because they are trying to copy a kind of Renaissance style and doing it really well. But also, obviously, if you're a blacksmith, they're obviously not from the 1600s. But if you are not a blacksmith, I think most people will think that these are just generally old. Anyway, I digress. The first thing I started doing was to try and figure out where does everything come from. So understanding the aesthetics and the inspiration of the period. I started looking into pattern books. Some of you might be familiar with pattern books, but from when printing started and you could start sharing ideas, we have these pattern books that are made by various artists all over Europe and distributed through networks. And they are the direct inspiration for most of the craft work that's happening during the Renaissance, the Baroque. So we have Heinrich Altegräber and Lucas Kilian. And Altegräber is working with the acanthus, which you can see is what turns into scrolls. And Kilian is working a lot with the grotesque, so one of the very defining features of the Renaissance. And all this was quite new to me, so I was really interested in trying to figure out how I could incorporate these ideas and fuse them with the metalwork of the period. So how does metalwork that we see come from something like this? And if you look at it, you can see a lot of the shapes that are kind of familiar to you, but also shapes that we don't work with at all in contemporary blacksmithing when we think about Renaissance work. So one of the first things I did was I just started drawing things in ways that kind of aesthetically made sense to me, taking various inspiration from the same time frame and geographical frame and putting them together in various ways. I will talk a lot more about this if you come to my workshop. I also worked with both Leonardo da Vinci and Dürer made these lattice work knots, and they were also incorporated into metalwork. And I tried to see if I could work with that same kind of style, but in a way that felt to me contemporary. And then I tried to develop some sketch techniques. It took me a while to understand that was what I was actually doing, but I started working with these various techniques, and I will explain that in a lot more depth if you come to one of my sketching workshops. And by the way, I mean, I have room for a lot more than 10 people, so if you feel that you're not included in some of the other workshops, there's always room. But one of the things I did was I tried to zoom in and just pick smaller part of a piece and see if I could develop that into something that had its own entity. I also used a technique where I took various objects from various related pieces and put them together in a way that for me felt contemporary. And then I used concept, but not actually the shape or the direct reference to the work. I ended up with these three grills. So the first one is very much just assuming from a Casper Finker work, focusing on the kind of colors and how they create some kind of tension and energy, having the scroll as a secondary thing. The second one is picking and mixing, so it's lattice work, but I'm trying to make it deeper, have some kind of relation to it. I'll try to skip a little faster because I know that Fika is just around the corner. I can talk for a long time about this. The third one is mainly just focusing on the color. So I've been using those in a lot of my private work. So I wanted to kind of, how can I do something that reference techniques, but it's not actually at all referencing the time period. And then I'm introducing one thing that I think we should talk a lot about. So this is modernist color. If you look at the original works from all up through history, there's so much color in it. And then sometime in how I've been researching it, at least in Sweden, around end of the 19th century, we have this trend of historicism, and then they decide that everything has to be really dark and medieval and la la la, which means that they paint all the metalwork black. So if you scrape at the metalwork in the churches, for instance, we have metalwork that dates back to like the 16 and 1700s. And you can see that there's just like with everything else, you can make color scales, and the metalwork has been painted in all kinds of fantastic colors. Especially in the Renaissance, they were just like any color, gold, silver, whatever, and they put in incorporate cloth and every kind of stuff there. And we kind of forgot that. And now everything's just black. And I want us to please help yourself. There's a whole palette of colors that you can use in your metalwork. Don't be afraid of it. We'll talk more about that. The other project that I just want to mention quite briefly is a later thing that I did. So I was lucky enough to work with another institution of the University of Gothenburg doing a research project into Swedish 18th century metalwork, decorative metalwork. They have an institution on the other side of the big lake here called the Craft Lab or Handverkslaboratoriet, where they work with craft research in relation to building culture in Scandinavia. And they work from the viewpoint of the craftsperson. So it's not super academic, and you can actually do your research as film or as interviews or whatever if you don't like writing. I don't mind writing, so I made another little booklet. Unfortunately, that is in Swedish because it's a Swedish university and they wanted that. So, but what I was looking at was these 17th century or 18th century metalwork in Sweden, and how we got our inspiration at that point from France and all these kind of things. That's not so important right now, but something that I fell for was that I realized that something I didn't know, but I realized that there's a lot of different ways of working with repoussé as well. So some of you are probably working with repoussé. I'll try not to talk about it in front of the Englishmen because they're always really weird and do things in a completely different way. But generally, there's a French style and then there's a more Central European style. So the French style is working with very thin material. They're working cold. They're working with stakes. The Central European style is more working with a thicker pieces of plate and working them hot over the anvil. That was new to me. It probably isn't to you. I was really fascinated with the Central European style, how like the volume in that was for me really interesting, and it didn't require that whole library of tools that you need to have to work with it in the French style. Funnily enough, this screen is from England, but we won't go into that because it's going to be too complicated. But this is in the DNA, and I was really interested in that. So I was lucky enough then to get some funding to look into how I can incorporate those processes into my own artistic process. And I started off by doing some kind of Frankensteining my previous work with these shapes. And then I ended up with doing this kind of work, which is kind of an elaboration of the style. So this is not really repoussé, it's more just kind of scroll work. I finally found some way where I could put all my need for making scrolls that I've been suppressing over all the years of living in Scandinavia under the fascist regime of modernism. Finally, I just scrolled away. This is a lucky student from somewhere in Germany during the SMUK exhibition a couple of years ago. But what I also wanted to just end up with talking about is that when we work with history and we work with form and we work with those traditions, it also, I think, for me at least, gives you the opportunity to start looking into history in general. And I find that researching these periods of time within blacksmithing, only focusing on the decorative aspects or kind of the aesthetic side of it, it's interesting and it carries my craft forward. But I also think that it's important for us to kind of see it in the light of how history evolves and what happens in history. I think it's really interesting to see how the focus changes after the 30 Years' War in Europe. So before that, in Sweden and Scandinavia, we were very inspired by the German-speaking central part of Europe. And after that war, which Germany or the German-speaking part of Central Europe kind of lost and got devastated and ended up with the plunder of Prague, we shift our focus to France, and all through the 1700s, here we are Francophiles, and everything good and interesting comes from France. Things like that are interesting because it makes you, for me, it was kind of, I'm so fascinated with this Central European style that never really reached here, but was so beautiful if you look at like some of the things made in the middle part of the 1700s in southern Germany, Austria, Czech Republic. There's so much decoration, there's so much work, but there's also so much wealth. And if you look, it's the same in France, it's the same here. There's so much wealth. That wealth comes from somewhere. It's not just money that drops from the sky. That wealth comes from transatlantic slave trade. It comes from colonialism. It comes from all these things that are today also really important and relevant in how we are managing this world that we're living in. So for me, it's important that we kind of don't see history as just like a past entity or something that we draw artistic inspiration from without actually seeing the whole picture of what is history and how can we use that picture to work with the questions that we are working with today as a society. Again, relating to also how do we have our rituals? How can we support each other? How can we build community? All these things. Right. So the question that I would like you to ponder on while we're here and maybe have conversations about, along with all the thousands of other questions that we're going to throw up into the air during this conference, are things like, how important is the historic heritage for grave markers today? That's something that I think most of you will have a take on, especially the ones who are working with grave markers. Like, what is your personal involvement with the history of your trade in relation to the markers that you're making? And how can we use that heritage? I don't think we have time for starting a debate now, right?
We have plenty of time, actually.
Do we? Okay, good. Yeah. Good. So we start with just saying questions. Are there any questions? You're also shy in the morning. We should do this in the pub later. There will be questions then. Yes, Daniel.
So I wonder, you say that some of the work that you've been working on now, this kind of feels contemporary, or So
yeah.
The most obvious question for you is like, you talk about how do you sense that something is contemporary work?
That is a very good question. I can't answer it. But I think that's one of these things that if we're looking at some of the work, I mean, if we're looking at these ones, for instance, so in relation to the Renaissance work, you always, for instance, you have this frame In the Renaissance work, it's always a flat frame. It's always lying down like this. So just by changing that frame to standing up, in my world, it's contemporary because it's obviously not Renaissance. But I know that from someone who is not into Renaissance blacksmithing, that makes no sense whatsoever. And I've had a lot of people reacting, especially to this one, because they think it looks so nice and traditional. And I mean, it does look nice and traditional, but it's also some cropped in ways that you would never do in Renaissance. You would never chop off the top of the spiral like that in a Renaissance piece of work. It's difficult to be clear about that, I think, as someone who's so engulfed. We all know that something that we know a lot about, you get really nerdy into, and then someone comes and talks to you about Japanese manga, and I'm like, well, but it all looks the same. How can you see the difference between that and that? Or like my mum would say, well, how can you hear the difference between that metal and that metal? And so, that's speed metal and that's metal, that's obvious. It's the same thing, so it's difficult for us and professionals to distinguish what is kind of one side and the other side. I think you need to go maybe on your own personal ideas, and then you need to be maybe for yourself at least able to have some answers if someone asks the question. But I guess most of what we do here is trying to figure out what is contemporary art and how do we work with it. So it's a really big question. No answers there. Yeah.
I would just want to remark that the railing you made is outside here.
Yeah. I made some railings that are also out here. I try to make them contemporary. You can go and have a look and judge for yourself if you think that contemporary. But that's also doing the same thing, trying to work with, you have this kind of modernist idea of what a railing is, which is basically a square box with round bars in it. And I just tried to work with architects so much that I was trying to do something that was so close to that as I could without being so boring that I would kill myself in boredom making it. That's the right example. Yeah.
Would you say technique has a big role in what you consider contemporary or not?
Yes and no. Because I mean, I see people in our department, we have students who come here with maybe no technical knowledge before they come here. And sometimes they approach technique and material in ways that we who have been working for 25 years would never do. But I think sometimes they make things that I could never have done because I'm so trained. The first year and a half I was in this institution doing my BA, I tried to unlearn all the rules that I'd learned. I tried to deliberately make false, because again, I come from that tradition in England, which was, when I went to school, was very kind of, the first half year we were just forging things onto millimeters. So now that that's a millimeter too long, you have to redo it, that kind of stuff. So being very, very focused on very, very good at the craft, but maybe not seeing what the material actually had to offer.
It's very different now.
Yeah, of course, it's very different. No, I'm not saying it's wrong. I mean, I think there's a place for everything. I think there's definitely a place for someone who's a very, very good craftsperson. I think it's important. I think it's something that is an anchor of what we do, that people are really, really good at a certain technique. But I also think that we should be better at letting in the people who are working with our material and our craft, but doing it without actually having that profound craft knowledge, because sometimes they see things that we don't see.
Well, speaking of architects, what role or place are they doing in this question?
Oh, I think, I mean, I was having a conversation with one of our students yesterday. I don't think he's here. And I started on my rant on architects and said, "Mum, that's sister." So his entire family is architects. Actually, my wife's entire family are architects. Architects is difficult. I mean, if you look, I come from Denmark, we are very interested in still upholding some kind of idea of modernism. If you look in France, if you look in Germany, if you look in England, the States, all of these places that have a bigger blacksmithing tradition than we do in Scandinavia, you also have a bigger variety because you have just a bigger population and a bigger palette of taste. So you have architects who work with this, who are really knowledgeable, who has a lot of good ideas in this, some places at least. And then you have architects who are not interested in craft. I think the biggest problem is that a lot of architects are not particularly interested, and they also have to know today so many different materials. So if you go back 200 years, there was like stone, concrete, bricks, metalwork, and wood kind of thing. But now there's like all these composite materials, there's all these solutions. And they also, the way I see architects is that they are striving to also have their own artistic intent in what they do. The difference between an architect and someone like me is that I do a piece of work and only the people following me on Instagram will see that. An architect do a piece of work and you have that big building standing in the middle of our communal space, being their statement, but being in all of us in our space. So therefore, I think as an architect, you need to have a lot more knowledge of what you can do and how you can do it, not just in relation to what the other architects will think, because that's another thing. And we do that as well as blacksmiths. We are making work for the other blacksmiths. I think, oh, this is really, they're all going to think that this is really interesting. And then we're like 1,500 people. But, and the architects do the same thing. They're making work for the other architects. It's just kind of big swinging. And we all do it, all trades do it, but there's some trades where it makes bigger impact than others. Is my opinion. I'm not an oracle. I can talk about architects for ages and ages, but I don't actually claim that I have the answers.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry, but Monica, you were first.
Well, Jokum, I just wanted to know your idea about contemporary versus modern and historic. So in the 19th century, there was a lot of revivalism, right?
Yeah.
Like there's Greek revival, there's Hellenism, there's Shinobazari. Is it, and I think it's interesting because when you work with students, right, their notion of what's modern or contemporary is radically different than those of us who grew up in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Because for people born in the 2000s, what happened in the 1900s seems ancient.
Old.
Right,
Yeah.
that's old, that's
Yeah.
historic to them.
Yeah.
What is your division between historic and the stuff that you sort of think of as modern or contemporary? And
Very good question. Again, I'm not sure I can answer because I'm working from the standpoint that I'm a young upcoming blacksmith. I'm 54.
I like the way you think, Jokum.
So I think it happens to all of us, doesn't it? At some point, it's like, oh, no, I can't apply for that anymore because I'm not under 45. It's a really good question. And it's a very interesting question, and I can't really give you answers for it. I think my immediate way of interpreting contemporary is if I do it, then it's contemporary. If it's someone who is older than me do it, then it's probably not as contemporary. But then you do have people, I mean, people still working, people still in the life, I guess, is in some way always contemporary. And then you have that whole historicism thing, which I think is really interesting. Because there's so many different approaches to history baked into that cake that we could kind of start picking out. But again, also, I'm not blaming anything, but because it's been considered bad taste, especially through modernism, then we have this whole present of historicism lying there waiting for us to start actually working with it and seeing what could they be doing this or neo-Gothic or all these kind of things that I find are really interesting artistically and aesthetically, but that we are not really allowed to look at because it's bad taste. And I mean, I know you know a thing or two about bad taste as well. So,
I'm fully immersed in my own.
No, but I mean, but it's the things that are interesting to start looking at also as a trade, as a craft, because where do we get our inspirations and why? And I think what some of the things that I'm trying to say with this talk is I think it's important that you come to this with some kind of knowledge, so that it's not just opinions, but you actually know something. And the more you open up for knowing something about the historical aspects of it, the more you can maybe make connections to what we're working with or doing today. Hopefully.
Yeah, and I think what you said about you tried to unlearn things that you know. I think doing things wrong deliberately is more interesting than doing things wrong because you don't know how to do it the sort of correct way or what is supposed to end up like. And I think the same thing with looking at precedents, you know, or a canon or whatever it is. You can only resist a canon if you actually know what the canon is.
Yeah. Unless you just completely just waltz through it and do something, which I see happening occasionally as well. Yeah, but I do agree with you.
I was wondering about, I mean, it was interesting how you bring in, you know, how you learn from the history, the aesthetics, and how they were making things. But I'm curious about the role of the maker in these times you were looking at, you know, their context within their community, maybe their society. Was there something in there that you would say would be helpful for today too?
Yeah, probably. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting was that during the Renaissance, as I read it and as I see it, at least within the blacksmithing trade, a lot of the actual designing would be done by the masters themselves. So they would be inspired by these pattern books, and then they would design their metalwork. And you have examples of them kind of so working with a carpenter. So the carpenter make a really big wooden door, and then you need hinges on that. And then the blacksmith come and he says, my hinges are big and amazing. So they put the hinges on all the really nice carpentry work. It's like, you know, I'm also a big ego. So you have these bigger egos in the Renaissance, but also something that maybe makes the style a lot more diverse, because you have all these interpretations. And something that happens when we start looking at France in the later part of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s is that France has a much more hierarchical system, and you have a king who decides someone, and then they decide these and these architects. And the architects are then the ones who make the drawings for all of the metalwork or all the design, basically. So that makes the styles maybe a little bit more unified, maybe because then you also see the architects have different opinions and there's this and that and whatever. But I also found it interesting that when you start looking at the architects, at least in Sweden, some of the architects that I was working with in my work with the craft lab, they all came from craftspeople. So they all had a dad or a granddad who was a stonemason or a blacksmith or a carpenter, someone who knew techniques, who knew the craft, who knew the trade, who was designing for the craft. And you see them actually sometimes designing things that are so complicated, like drawing things that are easier to draw, but to make them. And you can only do that if you have that knowledge. You can only do that if you really hate your daddy and you want to make him sweat. Then you can draw something that it's going to spend years to do. No, but I think that's an important lesson, that to design something, it's good to have that knowledge. At least to have the knowledge so that you can disregard it. And we can do that within ourselves. So if we have the knowledge of the historical work, then we can either choose to work with it or discard it, but we need to do that in a place of understanding instead of ignorance. Fika? No, maybe no more. More questions? It feels like exam this. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm very curious about, because you started talking about this architectural approach, and then the patterns and the motifs.
Yeah.
and then your own way of doing. And it's a similar question as Heiner, but this is the role of the work. So the function. And how do you see this work? One of the examples you did, it was like a more functional, like covering the radiator.
Yeah.
How do you see your work in the different contexts, like having a function and just standing there?
Yeah. I mean, I've been working with a lot of different, so I work on the scale from actually restoration work through to kind of trying to design my own takes to various functional things like gates and railings and stuff like that, and then to more what you call fine art work, so things that has maybe more of a mental or spiritual function than I can take this and do this with it kind of function. But I think though that you can, within all of that, you can incorporate the thought of these the things that I've been talking about, so like the knowledge of the historical craft, and you can put that into kind of any object, or having that idea of working with that. I mean, that's what I wanted to do with I spent quite a lot of time trying to work with architects to design systems for gates and railings and all of these things that we're still doing within architecture with a modernistic sensation to them, but that had just a tiny bit of craft in them, just something that kind of showed that even if it was just a rivet that was, you know, flat, but it was riveted instead of welded together. So I think you can apply it to basically anything if you have a knowledge of the period or the site that you're working with, and the knowledge of the craft, you can combine them. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm just trying to like open this thinking.
Yeah.
Because we normally I guess big part of this project is because of how we use today the materials, the shapes, the techniques, the concepts, and now it was just to open this.
Yeah, but I mean, I think I see that with all the crafts, all the trades, that you need to have some people within that trade who really know the techniques, who really goes deep into them and apply them to something. And then you also often need to have someone who can come in and challenge that. So if we are too closed, then it becomes stagnant. But if we're too open, then we lose the base. We lose the whole kind of craft foundation that we're standing. So it's a really delicate balance. And I think just talking about the blacksmith craft, I think that we also need to be quite aware of that as a craft, because we have a tendency to not wanting to embrace. I mean, I remember when I started blacksmithing, there were people who were angry at Albert Paley. I assume you all know who Albert Paley is, for selling out or doing welding. And he still I still have students that come from the preparatory educations and are like, am I allowed to weld? And I'm like, yeah, weld the fuck out of it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with welding. It's beautiful. You just need to know when you do it and when you not do it. Or you need to know when you can do it and when you can't do it, and then you can work with doing it when you're not allowed, just to be that person who does the opposite thing. You just need to be knowledgeable about it, I think.